Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're reading again today from Dickens' Stories About Children, and we're reading the story David Copperfield from the book by Dickens, David Copperfield. This is a long story in this book, and so I may divide this into two readings. But for today, we will start with David Copperfield. My name, like my father's before me, is David Copperfield. When I was little, I lived with my mother in a pretty house in the village of Blunderstone in Suffolk. I had never known my father, who died before I could remember anything, and I had neither brothers nor sisters. My pretty young mother and our kind, good servant, Peggotty, took care of me and made me very happy. We had few friends, and the only relation my mother talked about was an aunt of my father's, a tall and rather terrible old lady from all accounts, who had once been to see us when I was quite a tiny baby, and had been so angry to find I was not a little girl that she had left the house quite offended, and had never been heard of since. One visitor, excuse me, a tall, dark gentleman, I did not like at all, and was rather inclined to be jealous that my mother should be so friendly with the stranger. Peggotty and I were sitting one night by the parlor fire alone. I had been reading to Peggotty about crocodiles in a little book that I liked very much. I was tired of reading and dead sleepy, but having leave as a high treat to sit up until my mother came home from spending the evening at a neighbor's, I would rather have died upon my post, of course, than have gone to bed. I had reached that stage of sleepiness when Peggotty seemed to swell and grow immensely large. I propped my eyelids open with my two forefingers and looked perseveringly at her as she sat at work, at the little house with a thatched roof where the yard measure lived, at her workbox with a sliding lid with a view of St. Paul's Cathedral with a pink dome painted on the top, at the brass thimble on her finger, at herself, whom I thought lovely. I felt so sleepy that I knew if I lost sight of anything for a moment I was gone. "Peggotty," says I suddenly, "were you ever married?" "Lord, Master Davy," replied Peggotty, "what's put marriage in your head?" She answered with such a start that it quite awoke me. And then she stopped in her work and looked at me with her needle drawn out to its thread's length. "But were you ever married, Peggotty?" says I. "You are a very handsome woman, ain't you?" "Me handsome, Davy," said Peggotty. "Lauk, no, my dear, but what put marriage in your head?" "I don't know. You mayn't marry more than one person at a time, may you, Peggotty?" "Certainly not," says Peggotty with the promptest decision. "But if you marry a person and the person dies, why, then you may marry another person, mayn't you, Peggotty?" "You may," says Peggotty, "if you choose, my dear. That's a matter of opinion." "But what is your opinion, Peggotty?" said I. I asked her and looked curiously at her because she looked so curiously at me. "My opinion is," said Peggotty, taking her eyes from me after a little indecision and going on with her work, "that I never was married myself, Master Davy, and that I don't expect to be. That's all I know about the subject." "You ain't cross, I suppose, Peggotty, are you?" said I after sitting quiet for a minute. I really thought she was. She had been so short with me, but I was quite mistaken, for she laid aside her work, which was a stocking of her own, and opening her arms wide, took my curly head within them and gave it a good squeeze. I know it was a good squeeze, because being very plump, whenever she made any little exertion after she was dressed, some of the buttons on the back of her gown flew off, and I recollect that two burst to the opposite side of the parlor while she was hugging me. One day Peggotty asked me if I would like to go with her on a visit to her brother at Yarmouth. "Is your brother an agreeable man, Peggotty?" I inquired. "Oh, what an agreeable man he is!" cried Peggotty. "Then there's the sea, and the boats and ships, and the fishermen, and the beach, and Am to play with." Ham was her nephew. I was quite anxious to go when I heard of all these delights, but my mother, what would she do all alone? Peggotty told me my mother was going to pay a visit to some friends, and would be sure to let me go. So all was arranged, and we were to start the next day in the carrier's cart. I was so eager that I wanted to put my hat and coat on the night before. But when the time came to say goodbye to my dear mamma, I cried a little, for I had never left her before. It was a rather slow way of traveling, and I was very tired and sleepy when I arrived at Yarmouth and found Ham waiting to meet me. He was a great strong fellow, 6 feet high, and took me on his back and the box under his arm to carry both to the house. I was delighted to find that this house was made of a real big black boat that had been drawn far up on the sand. It had a door and windows cut in the side and an iron funnel sticking out of the roof for a chimney. Inside, it was very cozy and clean, and I had a tiny bedroom in the stern. I was very much pleased to find a little girl about my own age to play with. After tea, I said, "Mr. Peggotty." "Sir," says he. "Did you give your son the name of Ham because you lived in a sort of ark?" Mr. Peggotty seemed to think it a deep idea, but answered, "No, sir. I never give him no name. Who gave him that name then? Said I, putting question number 2 of the catechism to Mr. Peggotty. Why, sir, his father give it him, said Mr. Peggotty. I thought you were his father. My brother Joe was his father, said Mr. Peggotty. Dead, Mr. Peggotty? I hinted after a respectful pause. Drowned dead, said Mr. Peggotty. I was very much surprised that Mr. Peggotty was not Ham's father, and began to wonder whether I was mistaken about his relationship to anybody else there. I was so curious to know that I made up my mind to have it out with Mr. Peggotty. Little Emily, I said, glancing at her. She is your daughter, isn't she, Mr. Peggotty? No, sir. My brother-in-law Tom was her father. I couldn't help it. Dead, Mr. Peggotty? I hinted after another respectful silence. Drowned dead, said Mr. Peggotty. I felt the difficulty of resuming the subject, but had not got to the bottom of it yet, and must get to the bottom somehow, so I said, Haven't you any children, Mr. Peggotty? No, master, he answered with a short laugh. I'm a bachelor. A bachelor, I said, astonished. Why, who's that, Mr. Peggotty, pointing to the person in the apron who was knitting. That's Mrs. Gummidge, said Mr. Peggotty. Gummidge, Mr. Peggotty? But at this point, Peggotty, I mean my own Peggotty, made such impressive motions to me not to ask any more questions that I could only sit and look at all the company until it was time to go to bed. Mrs. Gummidge lived with them too, and did the cooking and cleaning, for she was a poor widow and had no home of her own. I thought Mr. Peggotty was very good to take all these people to live with him, and I was quite right, for Mr. Peggotty was only a poor man himself, and had to work hard to get a living. Almost as soon as morning shone upon the oyster shell frame of my mirror, I was out of bed and out with little Emily, picking up stones upon the beach. You're quite a sailor, I suppose? I said to Emily. I don't know that I supposed anything of the kind, but I felt it an act of gallantry to say something, and a shining sail close to us made such a pretty little image of itself at the moment in her bright eye that it came into my head to say this. No, replied Emily, shaking her head. I'm afraid of the sea. Afraid, I said, with a becoming air of boldness, and looking very big at the mighty ocean. I ain't. Ah, but it's cruel, said Emily. I have seen it very cruel to some of our men. I have seen it tear a boat as big as our house all to pieces. I hope it wasn't the boat that Father was drowned in, said Emily. No, not that one. I never saw that boat. Nor him? I asked her. Little Emily shook her head. Not to remember. Here was a coincidence. I immediately went into an explanation how I had never seen my own father, and how my mother and I had always lived by ourselves in the happiest state imaginable, and lived so then, and always meant to live so, and how my father's grave was in the churchyard near our house, and shaded by a tree, beneath the boughs of which I had walked and heard the birds sing many a pleasant morning. But there were some differences between Emily's orphanhood and mine, it appeared. She had lost her mother before her father, and where her father's grave was no one knew, except that it was somewhere in the depths of the sea. Besides, said Emily, as she looked about for shells and pebbles, your father was a gentleman, and your mother is a lady, and my father was a fisherman, and my mother was a fisherman's daughter, and my Uncle Dan is a fisherman. Dan is Mr. Peggotty, is he? Said I. Uncle Dan, yonder, answered Emily, nodding at the boathouse. Yes, I mean him. He must be very good, I should think. Good, said Emily. If I was ever to be a lady, I'd give him a sky blue coat with diamond buttons, nankeen trousers, a red velvet waistcoat, a cocked hat, a large gold watch, a silver pipe, and a box of money. I said I had no doubt that Mr. Peggotty well deserved these treasures. Little Emily had stopped and looked up at the sky in her enumeration of these articles as if they were a glorious vision. We went on again, picking up shells and pebbles. You would like to be a lady? I said. Emily looked at me and laughed and nodded. I should like it very much. We would all be gentlefolks together then, me and Uncle and Ham and Mrs. Gummidge. We wouldn't mind then when there came stormy weather, not for our own sakes, I mean. We would for the poor fishermen's, to be sure, and we'd help 'em with money when they can't come to any hurt. I was very sorry to leave these kind people, and especially little Emily, but still I was glad to think that I should get back to my own home. When I reached it, however, I found a great change. My mother was married to the dark man I did not like, whose name was Mr. Murdstone, and he was a stern, hard man who had no love for me and did not allow my mother to pet and indulge me as she had done before. Mr. Murdstone's sister came to live with us, and as she was even more difficult to please than her brother and disliked boys, my life was no longer a happy one. I tried to be good and obedient, for I knew it made my mother very unhappy to see me punished and found fault with. I had always had lessons with my mother, and as she was patient and gentle, I had enjoyed learning to read. But now I had a great many very hard lessons to do, and was so frightened when Mr. and Miss Murdstone were in the room that I did not get on at all well and was continually in disgrace. Let me remember how it used to be and bring one morning back again. I come into the second best parlor after breakfast with my books and an exercise book and a slate. My mother is ready for me at her writing desk, but not half so ready as Mr. Murdstone in his easy chair by the window, though he pretends to be reading a book, or as Miss Murdstone sitting near my mother stringing steel beads. The very sight of those two had such an influence over me that I begin to feel the words I have been at infinite pains to get into my head all sliding away and going, I don't know where. I wonder where they do go, by the by. I hand the first book to my mother. Perhaps it is a grammar, perhaps a history, or a geography. I take a last drowning look at the page as I give it into her hand and start off aloud at a racing pace while I have got it fresh. I trip over a word. Mr. Murdstone looks up. I trip over another word. Miss Murdstone looks up. I redden, tumble over half a dozen words and stop. I think my mother would show me the book if she dared, but she does not dare, and she says softly, "Oh, Davy, Davy." "Now, Clara," says Mr. Murdstone, "be firm with the boy. Don't say, 'Oh, Davy, Davy.' That's childish. He knows his lesson, or he does not know it." "He does not know it," Miss Murdstone interposes awfully. "I am really afraid he does not," says my mother. "Then you see, Clara," returns Miss Murdstone, "you should just give him the book back and make him know it." "Yes, certainly," says my mother. "That is what I intend to do, my dear Jane. Now, Davy, try once more and don't be stupid." I obey the first clause of the injunction by trying once more, but am not so successful with the second, for I am very stupid. I tumble down before I get to the old place, at a point where I was all right before, and stop to think. But I can't think about the lesson. I think of the number of yards of net in Miss Murdstone's cap, or of the price of Mr. Murdstone's dressing gown, or any such ridiculous problem that I have no business with, and don't want to have anything at all to do with. Mr. Murdstone makes a movement of impatience, which I have been expecting for a long time. Miss Murdstone does the same. My mother glances submissively at them, shuts the book, and lays it by as an arrear to be worked out when my other tasks are done. There is a pile of those arrears very soon, and it swells like a rolling snowball. The bigger it gets, the more stupid I get. The case is so hopeless, and I feel that I am wallowing in such a bog of nonsense that I give up all idea of getting out and abandon myself to my fate. The despairing way in which my mother and I look at each other as I blunder on is truly melancholy. But the greatest effect in these miserable lessons is when my mother, thinking nobody is observing her, tries to give me the cue by the motion of her lips. At that instant, Miss Murdstone, who has been lying in wait for nothing else all along, says in a deep, warning voice, "Clara." My mother starts, colors, and smiles faintly. Mr. Murdstone comes out of his chair, takes the book, and turns me out of the room by the shoulders. Day by day went along in this fashion. My only pleasure was to go up into a little room at the top of the house where I had found a number of books that had belonged to my own father, and I would sit and read about Robinson Crusoe and many tales of travels and adventures, and I imagined myself to be sometimes one and sometimes another hero, and went about for days with the centerpiece of an old set of boot trees, pretending to be a captain in the British Royal Navy. One morning, when I went into the parlor with my books, I found my mother looking anxious, Miss Murdstone looking firm, and Mr. Murdstone binding something round the bottom of a cane. A lithe and limber cane, which he left off binding when I came in, and poised and switched it threateningly in the air. "I tell you, Clara," said Mr. Murdstone, "I have often been flogged myself." "To be sure, of course," said Miss Murdstone. "Certainly, my dear Jane," faltered my mother meekly. "But do you think it did Edward good?" "Do you think it did Edward harm, Clara?" asked Mr. Murdstone gravely. "That's the point," said his sister. To this my mother returned, "Certainly, my dear Jane," and said no more. I felt apprehensive that I was personally interested in this dialogue, and sought Mr. Murdstone's eye as it lighted on mine. "Now, David," said he, "you must be far more careful today than usual." He gave the cane another poise and another switch, and having finished his preparation of it, laid it down beside him with an expressive look and took up his book. This was a good freshener to my presence of mind, so a beginning. I felt the words of my lessons slipping off, not one by one, or line by line, but by the entire page. I tried to lay hold of them, but they seemed, if I may so express it, to have put skates on, and to skim away from me with a smoothness of which there was no checking. We began badly and went on worse. I had come in with an idea of distinguishing myself rather, conceiving that I was very well prepared, but it turned out to be quite a mistake. Book after book was added to the heap of failures, Miss Murdstone being firmly watchful of us all the time. And when we came at last to the 5,000 cheeses, canes he made it that day, I remember, my mother burst out crying. "Clara," said Miss Murdstone in her warning voice. "I am not quite well, my dear Jane, I think," said my mother. I saw him wink solemnly at his sister as he rose and said, taking up the cane, "Why, Jane, we can hardly expect Clara to bear with perfect firmness the worry and torment that David has occasioned her today. Clara is greatly strengthened and improved, but we can hardly expect so much from her. David, you and I will go upstairs, boy." As he took me out the door, my mother ran toward us. Miss Murdstone said, "Clara, are you a perfect fool?" and interfered. I saw my mother stop her ears then, and I heard her crying. He walked me up to my room slowly and gravely. I am certain he had a delight in that formal parade of executing justice, and when we got there, suddenly twisted my head under his arm. "Mr. Murdstone, sir," I cried to him, pray don't beat me. I have tried to learn, sir, but I can't learn while you and Miss Murdstone are by. I can't indeed." "Can't you indeed, David?" he said. "We'll try that." He had my head as in a vise, but I twined round him somehow and stopped him for a moment, entreating him not to beat me. It was only for a moment that I stopped him, for he cut me heavily an instant afterwards, and in the same instant I caught the hand with which he held me in my mouth between my teeth and bit it through. It sets my teeth on edge to think of it. He beat me then as if he would have beaten me to death. Above all the noise we made, I heard them running up the stairs and crying out. I heard my mother crying out, and Peggotty. Then he was gone, and the door was locked outside, and I was lying fevered and hot and torn and sore and raging in my puny way upon the floor. How well I recollect, when I became quiet, what an unnatural stillness seemed to reign through the whole house. How well I remember, when my smart and passion began to cool, how wicked I began to feel. I sat listening for a long while, but there was not a sound. Excuse me. I crawled up from the floor, excuse me, and saw my face in the glass, so swollen, red, and ugly that it almost frightened me. My stripes were sore and stiff and made me cry afresh when I moved, but they were nothing to the guilt I felt. It lay heavier on my breast than if I had been a most atrocious criminal, I dare say. It had begun to grow dark, and I had shut the window. I had been lying for the most part with my head upon the sill, by turns crying, dozing, and looking listlessly out, when the key was turned, and Miss Murdstone came in with some bread and meat and milk. These she put down upon the table without a word, glaring at me the while with exemplary firmness, and then retired, locking the door after her. I never shall forget the waking next morning, the being cheerful and fresh for the first moment, and then the being weighed down by the stale and dismal oppression of remembrance. Miss Murdstone reappeared before I was out of bed, told me in so many words that I was free to walk in the garden for half an hour and no longer, and retired, leaving the door open that I might avail myself of that permission. I did so, and did so every morning of my imprisonment, which lasted 5 days. If I could have seen my mother alone, I should have gone down on my knees to her and besought her forgiveness. But I saw no one, Miss Murdstone excepted, during the whole time. The length of those 5 days I can convey no idea of to anyone. They occupy the place of years in my remembrance. On the last night of my restraint, I was awakened by hearing my own name spoken in a whisper. I started up in bed, and putting out my arms in the dark, said, "Is that you, Peggotty?" There was no immediate answer, but presently I heard my name again, in a tone so very mysterious and awful that I think I should have gone into a fit if it had not occurred to me that it must have come through the keyhole. I groped my way to the door, and putting my own lips to the keyhole, whispered, "Is that you, Peggotty, dear?" "Yes, my own precious Davy," she replied. "Be as soft as a mouse, or the cat'll hear us." I understood this to mean Miss Murdstone, and was sensible of the urgency of the case, her room being close by. "How's Mamma, dear Peggotty? Is she very angry with me?" I could hear Peggotty crying softly on her side of the keyhole, as I was doing on mine, before she answered, "No, not very." "What is going to be done with me, Peggotty, dear? Do you know?" "School, near London," was Peggotty's answer. I was obliged to get her to repeat it, for she spoke it the first time quite down my throat, in consequence of my having forgotten to take my mouth away from the keyhole and put my ear there, and though her words tickled me a good deal, I didn't hear them. "When, Peggotty?" "Tomorrow." "Is that the reason why Miss Murdstone took the clothes out of my drawers?" which she had done, though I had forgotten to mention it. "Yes," said Peggotty. "Box." "Shan't I see Mamma?" "Yes," said Peggotty. "Morning." Then Peggotty fitted her mouth close to the keyhole and delivered these words through it with as much feeling and earnestness as a keyhole has ever been the medium of communicating, I will venture to assert, shooting in each broken little sentence in a convulsive little burst of its own. Davy dear, if I ain't been exactly as intimate with you lately as I used to be, it ain't because I don't love you just as well and more, my pretty poppet, and because I thought it better for you and for someone else besides. Davy, my darling, are you listening? Can you hear? Yes, Peggotty, I sobbed. My own, said Peggotty with infinite compassion. What I want to say is that you must never forget me, for I'll never forget you, and I'll take as much care of your Mamma, Davy, as I ever took of you, and I won't leave her. The day may come when she'll be glad to lay her poor head on her stupid, cross old Peggotty's arm again. And I'll write to you, my dear, though I ain't no scholar, and I'll... Peggotty fell to kissing the keyhole as she couldn't kiss me. Thank you, dear Peggotty, said I. Oh, thank you, thank you. Will you promise me one thing, Peggotty? Will you write and tell Mr. Peggotty and little Emily and Mrs. Gummidge and Ham that I am not so bad as they might suppose, and that I sent them all my love, especially to little Emily? Will you, if you please, Peggotty? The kind soul promised, and we both of us kissed the keyhole with the greatest affection. I patted it with my hand, I recollected, as if it had been her honest face, and parted. In the morning, Miss Murdstone appeared as usual and told me I was going to school, which was not altogether such news to me as she supposed. She also informed me that when I was dressed, I was to come downstairs into the parlor and have my breakfast. There I found my mother very pale and with red eyes, into whose arms I ran and begged her pardon from my suffering soul. Oh, Davy, she said, that you could hurt anyone I love. Try to be better, pray to be better. I forgive you, but I am so grieved, Davy, that you should have such bad passions in your heart. Miss Murdstone was good enough to take me out to the cart and to say on the way that she hoped I would repent before I came to a bad end. And then I got into the cart and the lazy horse walked off with it. We might have gone about half a mile and my pocket handkerchief was quite wet through when the carrier stopped short. Looking out to ascertain for what, I saw to my amazement Peggotty burst from a hedge and climb into the cart. She took me in both her arms and squeezed me until the pressure on my nose was extremely painful, though I never thought of that until afterwards when I found it very tender. Not a single word did Peggotty speak. Releasing one of her arms, she put it down in her pocket to the elbow and brought out some paper bags of cakes, which she crammed into my pockets, and a purse, which she put into my hand, but not one word did she say. After another and a final squeeze with both arms, she got down from the cart and ran away, and my belief is, and has always been, without a solitary button on her gown. I picked up one of several that were rolling about and treasured it as a keepsake for a long time. The carrier looked at me as if to inquire if she were coming back. I shook my head and said I thought not. Then come up, said the carrier to the lazy horse, who came up accordingly. Having by this time cried as much as I possibly could, I began to think it was of no use crying any more, especially as neither Roderick Random nor that captain in the Royal British Navy had ever cried, that I could remember, in trying situations. The carrier, seeing me in this resolution, proposed that my pocket handkerchief should be spread upon the horse's back to dry. I thanked him and assented, and particularly small it looked under those circumstances. I had now leisure to examine the purse. It was a stiff leather purse with a snap and had 3 bright shillings in it, which Peggotty had evidently polished up with whitening for my greater delight. But its precious contents were 2 half-crowns folded together in a bit of paper, on which was written in my mother's hand, "For Davy, with my love." I was so overcome by this that I asked the carrier to be so good as to reach me my pocket handkerchief again. But he said he thought I had better do without it, and I thought I really had, so I wiped my eyes on my sleeve and stopped myself. For good, too, though in consequence of my previous emotions I was still occasionally seized with the stormy sob. After we had jogged on for some little time, I asked the carrier if he was going all the way. "All the way where?" inquired the carrier. "There," I said. "Where's there?" inquired the carrier. "Near London," I said. "Why, that horse," said the carrier, jerking the rein to point him out, "would be deader than pork before he got over half the ground." "Are you only going to Yarmouth?" I asked. "That's about it," said the carrier. "And there I shall take you to the stagecoach, and the stagecoach that'll take you to wherever it is." I shared my cakes with the carrier, who asked if Peggotty had made them, and I told him yes, she did all our cooking. The carrier looked thoughtful, and then asked if I would send a message to Peggotty from him. I agreed, and the message was, "Barkis is willing." While I was waiting for the coach at Yarmouth, I wrote to Peggotty, "My dear Peggotty, I have come here safe. Barkis is willing. My love to Mamma. Yours affectionately. P.S. He says he particularly wanted you to know Barkis is willing." We'll stop there and start next time with the second half of this story. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.